Hello and welcome to Two Car Pros. Today we're going to be taking a look at what might be causing your intermittent misfire issue. So an intermittent misfire is something that happens when you're hammering on the gas real hard, say you're going on the freeway and you have wide open throttle, and all of a sudden your car or truck kind of goes like this. It kind of coughs a little bit. That's an intermittent misfire because it doesn't really happen at idle and it's hard to replicate only when you're hard on the throttle. So basically, it's an intermittent misfire. I have a clip here of what that might look like. It might be a little hard to tell. It's kind of hard to pick up on film, but here you go. So that was me getting on the freeway in my truck, which had developed an intermittent misfire. Now, the first thing you should do if you run into that problem is change your spark plugs. That is like the easiest, cheapest thing to do. Spark plugs, if it stops doing it, it's fixed. If it doesn't, you can move on to the topic of today's videos, which is ignition coils. That is like the #1 forgotten thing of cars. Everyone does their spark plugs and oil and air filter and all that good stuff, but they forget their ignition coils and they go out around 100,000 miles, and my truck happened to have 130. So they do go out. You can test some of them, but not all of them. I go over how to test it, but that doesn't always work all the time. So sometimes your ignition coil can develop a misfire when it's under heavy load and test totally normal. And other times it'll test off, like I show you further down in this video. So the best bet to hunt down an intermittent misfire, because it's insanely annoying and it will only progressively get worse, is just replace all your ignition coils. And I know there's a lot of people probably in the comments saying that fuel injectors can do it too, and fuel injectors are the same thing. It's another thing people forget. So if you replace your ignition coils and you still have an intermittent misfire, check your fuel injectors. They can do that too. It's the same basic principle. When it's under heavy load, the coil inside the primary and secondary coil don't work as they should, so you don't get a spark when it's under heavy load. And the same thing for a fuel injector, actually. It's the same exact principle. You put a lot of electric load into a fuel injector and it doesn't open like it should, or it doesn't fire as it should. So with all of that out of the way, let's jump into replacing ignition coil and looking how we can test them. So here's the interesting thing about ignition coils when they go out. You can see there's no check engine code, but when we plug in our scanner, there is a code because it's a latent code, it's pending. So we know an ignition coil is going out. So the first thing we're going to do is undo the negative battery terminal cable because we'll be working with electrical today. And whenever you're doing that, it's a good idea to unplug the battery. And we can stuff the negative terminal cable down here to make sure it doesn't accidentally touch while we're working on it. Alright, so here we are on the top side of the engine, on the right on my V8 here, and there's only one bolt holding the ignition coil to the top of the engine here. So we're just going to undo that real quick. I've already unplugged the electrical connector. It's very simple. You just push on the safety and pull it straight out. You want to be a little careful with the electrical connector though, because they do have a tendency to snap off. Now, if you're watching this video and you have an inline 4, your job's even easier because you only really have to go through 4 ignition coils. There you go. Once the bolts are removed, we can pull the ignition coil straight up and it should come out with ease. So I've removed all 8 ignition coils out of the truck. I know which cylinder came out of where, so I've tested them all and it turns out this is our culprit, and I'll show you in testing that real quick. So if you didn't want to replace all the ignition coils like I'm going to be doing, because ignition coils only last about 100,000 miles anyway, and this truck's at 134,000, so it's time. And look at the condition of this ignition coil. You can see metal in there. Like that's not good. That's probably why this one's not working quite right. So this came out of cylinder 3. So let's say you didn't want to replace all your ignition coils, even though you probably should. You can just replace the ignition coil for cylinder 3. So that's a super awesome trick if you don't want to replace all your ignition coils. But you really should. Trust me, just do it. So I think I found our culprit here. When I measure the ohms resistance on this ignition coil, our multimeter kind of reads very low. So what has happened here, yeah, it's just reading all over the place, but I get a consistent low off camera. So what has happened is the coils inside this ignition coil, there's a primary coil and a secondary coil in here, have just gotten hot and cold an absolute ton over its lifetime. This truck has 130,000 miles, and all of the ignition coils are original, and it just keeps getting hot and cold and overused. Not overused, but used for quite a long time. And the coils inside of it just get old and they stop stepping up the voltage like it should be doing. So it takes your 14 volts from your car and steps it up to like 20,000 or whatever your ignition system requires. So it takes low voltage high amperage and turns it into high voltage low amperage, and that's what causes your spark plug to ignite. And if this isn't working 100% all the time, especially when you're really hammering on it, when you're gunning it like I was earlier, it requires big electricity, and if it can't handle that, you will get a misfire because the cylinder isn't producing power. So that's why that happens. Now, we can compare it to our new unit here. I've gotten some Motorcraft ones, and the reason I bring up Motorcraft, even though this is a general video for most automobiles, is you want to use the ignition coils that came from factory. You want the ones that would be put in at the dealership. You can get them on Amazon or Rock Auto. I really like Rock Auto. We're just going to make sure they're identical, and they are. So that's super good. These even have dielectric grease already smeared in there, so you don't have to apply it, which is super cool. I can't stress this enough. I know there's a ton of these aftermarket ignition coils on Amazon, and they're yellow and red, and they look really cool, and they make outrageous claims, but they go out really easy. And if you don't want to be in the same situation you're in now, a couple months down the road, you're going to want to use the OEM ones, whoever makes your vehicle. I have a Ford F-150, so I'm using Ford Motorcraft parts. So as you can see, that's our new ignition coil. I removed that one earlier. It's really simple. You just replace the bolt and the electrical connector. It just pushes straight on. It couldn't be any easier. I've done that for all 8 cylinders. Now we're going to see if it does that intermittent misfire anymore after we re-plug in the negative terminal side of the battery. So that's basically how you fix an intermittent misfire. It's completely fixed now. It's fairly simple, and ignition coils are totally something people forget a lot, and that's okay because you don't really think about it a lot, right? You go, oh, I need to replace the spark plugs, and you replace, I need to change the oil, and you do all that awesome stuff, but ignition coils don't really come up on the list there, but they do need to be changed out about every 100,000 miles, and they're not that expensive either. But I will say this, please do get your OEM ignition coils. I know on Amazon there's a lot of companies that make replacement ignition coils, and they make all kinds of outrageous claims, but I've seen a lot of those go bad really, really quickly. They don't have a great warranty with them. So if I were you, I would just get the OEM ignition coil from your maker. So I have a Ford, so I got Motorcraft parts. But you can buy those on Amazon too, so I would look into that. The site I can recommend the most though is Rock Auto. RockAuto.com is amazing, and they usually have everything I need. I'm not sponsored by them, that's just my honest opinion. With all of that said, your intermittent misfire should be fixed. If it's not though, head on over to twocarpros.com and you can ask a question for absolutely free. We don't charge you a thing. You can even log in with Facebook, so it's super easy, and our experts will be along shortly to help you out with diagrams, videos, pictures, and everything curtailed to your exact make and model of vehicle. So that's super exciting. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you're subscribed, and I'll see you next time.